All right, sir, I am recording and attendees are joining in right now.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me call the meeting to order, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Delta Independent Science Board meeting, and I hope you're all well and happy and healthy. To start off, I need to say that in accordance with federal, state, and local guidelines to protect public health and safety in response to COVID-19, this meeting will be conducted entirely via remote access. We will take written questions and comments, and please email your public comments to disb@deltacouncil.ca.gov. And in your request, please indicate the agenda item in which you would like your public comment read. If you prefer to provide oral comments, please use the raise hand function in Zoom or email the same email on the agenda item in which you would like to provide public comment. And then afterwards, wait until you're called upon, and when you're called upon, provide your name and affiliation. So to get the meeting going, I'll give a roll call, and please, board members, state your full name and whether or not you have any new declarations to claim since our last meeting. And I'll go first, Steve Brandt, no new declarations. Jay?
Jay Lund, no new declarations.
Jim?
Jim Cloran, no declarations.
Virginia?
Virginia Dale, no new declarations.
Joe?
Joe Fernando, no new declarations.
Tom?
Tom Holzer, no new declarations.
Diane?
Diane McKnight, no new declarations.
Bob?
Bob Nyman, no new declarations.
And Lisa?
Lisa Wanger, no new declarations.
Okay, thanks everyone. We're going to move right on to item number 2, which is the chair's report. And I don't know if you all read the agenda, and we put together a sort of a formal statement to entitle the Curtailment of Delta Independent Science Board Activities. And I'm more or less going to read that now to get it onto the public record, as well as discussed at the December 17th meeting. Members of the DISB are now acting as unpaid volunteers, and the state of California has not yet secured a way to financially compensate Delta ISB members for its activities as they have done in the past. And the timetable to resolve this is unknown. The status necessitates curtailing the agenda and activities of the Delta ISB to a much lower all-volunteer level. And so consequently, substantial delays in many of the DISB's anticipated and legislative mandated reviews, products, and activities are expected. The Delta ISB looks forward to returning to its high level of productivity as soon as the state resolves this issue. I did receive an update yesterday, and I guess the good news is that there has been a formal approval, I believe at the governor's level, of the per diem appointments for board members. So that was a significant step forward. We do not yet know, and it has not yet been decided as to what that per diem would entail and when it would exactly be implemented. There are some further steps, including making actual appointments to those per diem state appointments. It's not expected to occur before our next meeting in November, but the actual date is hopefully shortly thereafter, but uncertain. So in the meantime, we were going to operate as we are under completely volunteer levels. 2 things along that line. One is that we decided at the last board member meeting that we would hold 2-hour highly focused meetings in place of our normally extended monthly meetings. And we would do 2 things. One is to continue making progress towards those reviews that we felt were either near completion or high priority. And secondly, to explore possibly new ideas for future reviews down the road. And this would be something where we would have a presentation or informational seminar that would serve 2 purposes. One, to provide particularly the new board members with some more background on some important issues facing the Delta, and then to have a dialogue and a discussion and talk about what might we look at in terms of possible reviews down the road, more or less a brainstorming session. So we've scheduled 3 of those down the road. We'll talk a little bit more towards the end about what the future ones are. But today in today's agenda is really just 2 points. The first thing on the agenda is to have Jay Lund give us lead a discussion on the science, water supply reliability, and Delta conveyance issues, and then we'll have an open discussion and questions, and that should be fun. And then the second component is to have a briefing on where we are with the science needs assessment workshop and the science needs assessment report, and moving step forward on that. I think that I've gotten from each of you sort of a guesstimate of how many volunteer hours you could put in per month. And so we have some idea of what the effort level could be for the board. And I think with that effort level, I think we can move forward on the science needs assessment workshop. So hopefully you'll pay close attention to the second agenda item, because we want to devote some of your time for that, particularly in the probably in the December timeframe. With that, I guess, are there any public comment? That's my full report. And are there any public comments on that agenda item?
Hey, Steve, it's Tanya here. I just didn't get to chime in on roll call, so wanted to make sure you knew I was here.
Or did I miss your name? Okay. Tanya.
Yes, Tanya Heikela, no new declarations. I'm here.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I guess, first of all, is there any questions from the board members on what I just presented? Okay, and public comments have been.
There are none.
All right, we're moving on to item number 3, and that is a informational item and discussion on science, water supply reliability, and Delta conveyance, and that'll be led by Jay.
Jay, you're muted.
There, how's that? Can you see my screen all right?
Yes.
All right. So I'd like to give a little bit of an overview of water supply reliability estimation as a field. This will be somewhat different from what most of you all have in your backgrounds. But it's one of the 2 co-equal goals for the management of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. This is an adaptation of a presentation I gave about a year or so ago on the subject, but I've updated it a little bit here and there. So a little outline of what I want to talk about. First, begin with water system portfolios. We often think about water system reliability as if it's only one source of water, but for most of California, most major supplies have a portfolio of water supplies and a portfolio of water demand management that they do all together in a relatively integrated way. And so that's the little bit larger context that I think we want to think about water supply reliability. And water supply reliability also has something to do with demand. So the more demands you have on a system, the more difficult it is. And we have several different kinds of demands. And so I think one of our concerns is how do we consider the different kinds of human water demands as well as environmental water demands in the evaluation and estimation and management of this system. Talk a little bit about sources of unreliability, what makes what can make a water system unreliable, and then get into the meat of it on what approaches are typically taken for estimating water supply reliability, what metrics are used, some lessons from all this, and then have a slide or so on the ongoing review on water supply reliability estimation. I want to begin with one of my favorite cartoons, which I think summarizes how well most of us understand our water supply systems. And I think it also illustrates how reliable most of our water systems are, at least for human purposes, in that most of us feel quite comfortable not knowing all the details about how water gets to us. I think this figure also illustrates pretty well where you have to begin whenever you talk about water to any public group or any political group, any group of politicians or leaders. Those of you from outside of California, I have a little slide here on the complexity of this system. We have a very elaborate water supply system in California, but it comes from the complexity of our hydrology and our water demand. So on the map to the left, the dark blue areas are the parts of California, the 20% of the surface area of California that is responsible for 2/3 of all the runoff in the state. The light blue, 20% of the surface area of California is responsible for an additional 24% of the state. So together, 90% of the surface area comes from 40% of the land area. The red area to the south primarily is 30% of the surface area of the state is responsible for 0.1% of all the runoff. Now, next think about where are the human water demands in the system? Well, there's in the Central Valley, and most of those water demands are actually in the red and orange parts of the Central Valley down the south. The Imperial Valley, which is completely in the red zone. And then we have some important coastal agriculture that's very little of which is actually tied to the Delta. The major cities in the San Francisco Bay Area, Central Valley, Fresno, Sacramento, and then Southern California, where probably about 2/3 of the state's population resides, is also native, pretty dry. The scale of this system relative to most other eastern states is a silhouette of Massachusetts just for scale. So to manage this system where the water is not where we want it as humans, and it doesn't even fall in the right season. So California has a Mediterranean climate, which means that this water is available in the winter when we really want it in the summer. We've had to move water in space and time by quite a bit. So this map to the right shows a lot of the infrastructure, the major infrastructure of the system. Huge numbers of reservoirs, major groundwater basins, particularly the Central Valley, and some quite large aqueducts in different colors here. The other thing I really like about this map is that it's very colorful. I think it's cartographically interesting that way. And this comes from all these bits of infrastructure being owned by different groups, different layers of government, different federal agencies, different state agencies, and quite a lot by many, many local and regional water agencies. So all of this has to sort of function as one system, and over time has somewhat done this to operate in a very challenging water supply environment with a lot of inverse seasonality and a lot of variability. This chart here shows what our water year here is like. We have a very long dry season and a very short wet season, it seems. Our water year begins October 1st, and it's not all that unusual. We haven't gotten really any precipitation yet this year, but we should be starting to see some in the coming weeks. And then we'll have a few months up through about usually early April when basically the rains stop. And the number of storms, you can sort of count up the number of storms. They're not A few large storms make the difference between a wet year and a dry year here in California. And then we have a long dry season. And this shows the cumulative precipitation for the more water-rich area of California up here in the north. Quite a lot of variability between years. Just to emphasize that point on the variability between years, this is the annual coefficient of variation for precipitation from precipitation gauges all across the continental US. I'm from Delaware over here originally. And you can see it's pretty boring in terms of annual variability and precipitation. As you move west, it gets more, and then when you get to California, it's definitely weird. And when you get to Southern California, we have a much greater annual coefficient of variation. So we have quite a lot of variation within the year, and then tremendous amount of variation also relative to other parts of the country between years. So we got lots. As I tell people, we have more floods and droughts per average year than any other part of the country. This is a plot of the unimpaired Delta outflow, as if there were no projects or water diversions. The green would be the average year. The red would be the driest year of record. And the blue was the wettest year of record up until most recently. 2017 was actually tremendously wet, even wetter than 83 for Northern California. But you can see the seasonality, and you can see the effect of snowmelt in these latter months. So essentially our precipitation ends in April, but we have a snowmelt pulse coming out for a few months after that. So water systems, the right map is a simplified California water system, as you saw before. And I think just for us to get a little bit more conceptual clarity, here's sort of the elements of a typical water system. We'll have a surface water source. We'll often have surface water reservoirs here in green, groundwater basins, which typically have more storage capacity than surface water. And then we have movements of water in and out, sometimes imported and exported with other basins. And then we'll have different kinds of human water demands and different kinds of environmental water demands at different locations at different times. So you can sort of imagine how you can reduce this simple one to a system of equations. It's the same kind of the same equations you can apply to anything more complex. Here's an example of what it looks like for water supply reliability for Orange County. They'll have their Delta water supplies. They have water marketing transfers that they make with Metropolitan Water District and other folks. They have some local reservoirs and groundwater banks. They have Colorado River supplies that come in as well. And then they have their own water demands that they manage. And they try to manage all of these sources together, all these water demands together, both for planning timescales and certainly in operational timescales. And they worry about climate change. This table is kind of what are the portfolio elements that you can have in a water supply system, sort of in a large conceptual way. We have quite a few different types of water sources. We have ways of moving that water about in space and ways of moving that water about in time, some of which happens naturally with snowpack, some of which happens artificially, and some of which is natural and artificial, as with aquifers. We have lots of ways of treating water to make water available for different kinds of water uses that they wouldn't naturally be available for. And there's all kinds of operational strategy, operating rules, operating policies, operating agreements that one can have to juggle and logistically manage all of these sources and sinks and treatment and facilities, infrastructure together. So that's the top part is the water supply side of a portfolio, water supply portfolio. The middle parts here are all the different water use efficiency and water use reduction activities that you can have, both for agricultural uses, urban uses, ecosystem uses, recreation, pretty much any use. We have a variety of water use efficiency kinds of things and water use reduction activities that we can do, all of which come at costs. because this water is useful and valued for quite a few different purposes. So as you can see from the earlier charts, these water systems involve a lot of different groups of people, a lot of different agencies, a lot of different individual decision makers, from the water users to the different water managers that often coordinate and have coordinating agreements, have water market activities among them. And so a third, I think, important aspect of a water system portfolio is what are the incentives so that people work well together? Certainly prices, markets, norming, shaming, education, subsidies, taxes, these kinds of things that are necessary to keep the social cohesion that is needed to keep these systems working well together. Here's another example of a portfolio for San Diego, how they've over time been diversifying their portfolio from just almost essentially dependent on Metropolitan Water District to having quite a bit of diversification from that over time, including potable reuse, some desalination, groundwater, different ways of trying to get water from the Colorado River across and like. It's important to emphasize, I think that these portfolios and water management activities happen at lots of different scales, local scales. There's a lot of different activities that the local agencies themselves can do. And they can work with other neighboring agencies and distant agencies to implement some of these. And then there are statewide and regional activities that help regions cooperate, as well as things like state plumbing codes and the like, which can affect demand. So our water management activities, including planning, essentially become portfolio planning to try to come up with desirable mixes of all these actions that will work well under the wide variety of hydrologic conditions and long-term water demand conditions that we expect for the system. Water demands are sort of a neglected aspect, I think, of water supply reliability, where we have many different types of demands. Certainly, most of us think of urban water demands for drinking, for sanitation, for landscaping, all the things that we do with cities, commercial, industrial as well. Agriculture has itself quite a diversity of water demands for different kinds of crops, different kinds of soil management, leaching of soils, of salt from soils, and the like. With trees, that's essentially a permanent demand for the lifetime of those trees, whereas vegetables and pasture land, you can decide to fallow for a year without extraordinary economic losses, whereas if you followed trees and didn't water them in this climate for a year, the costs can be quite large, unless you were going to remove that orchard the next year anyway. We have quite a lot of interest and concern with environmental water demands in terms of quantity, in terms of quality, the dilution of pollutants, the importance of those water supplies to sustain different kinds of habitat at different times of year, under different wet and dry kind of year conditions. Lots of different ways that water work to support ecosystems where people are still trying to work a lot of these demands out in a more formal way. These demands vary with time. Certainly, urban water demands vary by the hour during the day. All these water demands vary seasonally. They vary also over longer time periods with historical development and economic conditions. Sort of a final line here on water demands. All water uses and water shortages are not equally valued. Everybody has a little different idea of how they should be valued differently, but I think there ought to be a lot of consensus that they are valued differently by different people at different times. There's a couple of different views on the quantification of these water demands. One is to have sort of point demand volumes over time. So this environmental water use might be high at some times, low at others. Agricultural water use for irrigations can tend to be seasonal, but relatively low at other times of year. Urban water use in California, we have a lot of landscape irrigation in one season, but relatively low but still quite valuable indoor water uses the rest of the year. This is the typical way that most water demands are quantified. But if you go a little deeper below the surface and you think about the economic value of those demands, you'll see that they also vary at any given time. The volume of that water has different incremental values as you move up. So typically there's a diminishing incremental value of additional water for most uses, although sometimes they have weirder shapes than this. So the consequences of shortages, I think, are very important when you're characterizing water demands. There's a couple of great quotes on the subject. There's a shortage of sports cars. I don't have one. So when you hear people complaining about water shortages, this quote comes to mind. People often will complain about shortages, meaning they would like to have more for free, please. Then the final quote, I think, again, brings to mind this economic view of water shortages. There is rarely a shortage of water, but often a shortage of cheap water, just like for sports cars. This diminishing value of additional water, I think, is pretty well illustrated by this chart of the cumulative value of agriculture in California in terms of jobs and revenues. And so we've sort of ordered the major crops from the high valued, high jobs ones to the lower value ones. And you can note that about half of the irrigated acreage in California is responsible for 85 to 90% of the acreage and of the water use, for that matter. The same kind of general shape also applies for urban water use. About half of our urban water use in California is for landscape irrigation, which has really very little economic value, at least in a drought year. We touch on water supply reliability, sources of unreliability, certainly lack of inflow, drought. One of the bigger sources of unreliability in actual municipal water systems nationally is floods, where a flood will come along and take out a drinking water treatment plant. Earthquakes, wildfires, we've had some serious unreliability in some small systems in California due to wildfires the last few years. Mechanical and operational failures, certainly the Flint system was an example of that. Human failures leading to operational failures. Increasing water demands. Cape Town, South Africa had some problems with not preparing for growing water demands. Regulatory systems, for environmental regulations, there's a lot of concern that they will reduce water availability for other human uses. Sometimes you'll have agreements to share water and the agreements fall through, and then of course multiple failures can occur from time to time. So lots of different ways you can have unreliability. In terms of representing unreliability, we typically look at events and time series and probabilities. We'll look at particular scenarios of what could happen, time series of scenarios happening or not happening, reliability, unreliability, events happening, not happening, and then trying to digest those down into probabilities. And then using basically historical experiences, scenarios of concern, or synthetic cases as a basis for characterizing the conditions and potential unreliability. We use a lot of time series in a lot of this, and often do some kinds of Monte Carlo analysis to estimate probabilities from all of this. Typically, there'll be a system simulation model that basically takes elaborations on that simple system that we looked at before, where we have inputs of inflows, the capacities of different elements of the system, the water demands we expect, and the operating rules. We'll have a time step-based simulation as we sort of march through time with different inflows and demands, operating with the rules within the capacities and conservation of mass. As outputs, we get deliveries, shortages, and losses, and then we can interpret those results probabilistically. Simulation modeling is basically the approach we use, sort of what-if kind of modeling, if you will. We try to represent these systems, these very complex systems. So we have a legion of simplify details and capacities and responses. These simulations are run for each case to estimate responses and conditions and consequences, often to explore different operating strategies, operating rules, and the like. And then we assign probabilities to these results and try to assess the overall reliabilities and consequences for what that should mean for operating and planning and policy decisions. So as an example, this is the kind of results you might get out of a model, and then you'll rank order these and then sort them and then use them to develop probability exceedance plot for different amounts of water exports, in this case out of the Delta. This comes from the 2015 State of California Delivery Capabilities Report with Delta tunnels and with existing conditions. And I want to note that in that year, the year 2014 and 2015 actual deliveries during the drought were a little bit less than anything that they predicted in that modeling. So you always have to take model results and any kind of analysis with a grain of salt. This just reminds you of that. We also look at seasonal operational reliabilities, something called position analysis. I'll fly through it in the interest of time. But this is very commonly done each season for seasonal operations planning, and then in droughts, you'll try to game out for several years sometimes how to best manage the system probabilistically over time. This I've already mentioned. It's really important to interpret these probability estimates in context. These are not numbers that have, a relevance outside of the larger context of what available problems and options exist for the water managers and policymakers. There's a lot of modeling error in these kind of processes that are unavoidable. A couple of my favorite quotes on this: "All models are wrong, but some are useful," by the famous statistician George Box. And then the purpose of computing is insight, not numbers. So when I see these kind of studies done, I'm always interested in, well, what do you learn from this? I don't particularly care about the numbers. I'm looking for what can you learn from the numbers and the patterns in the numbers. But all the components of this modeling have different kinds of elements of formulation, calibration, version control, testing, interpretation that goes into this. So to me, the interpretation and the documentation of this process is quite important. Probably the most long-standing, regularly done water supply reliability studies, certainly related to the Delta, is that done by for the State Water Project, the Delivery Capabilities Report. So this is their a couple of different conditions for 2017. They update it every 2 years. Local areas tend to do their own analyses. Here's one for Orange County. They have a very complex local system or regional system. They've been looking at different kinds of climate change and different kinds of delta management activities and how that would affect their delivery reliabilities and shortage reliability, shortage probability results. And it shows that these are certainly the major water users in California, certainly the urban ones, do a lot of this kind of analysis internally and with others quite often. So Orange County its water system lies within the Metropolitan Water District, and Metropolitan Water District does the analyses, making assumptions about how Orange County is going to react and vice versa. So this is a pretty integrated system, and everybody does their analysis on their own and sometimes together. Metropolitan Water District, here's an example of their integrated water management analyses. And as a wholesaler, they basically collect every local water user's unreliability and feel they have to try to manage for it. So they try to keep a fair bit of water in storage just for such occasions. This is a little bit of a complex diagram worth a couple of minutes. So this is another one of those cumulative probability plots, the non-exceedance probability and the annual water delivery. So these axes are switched in this professional field from what they normally are in probability distributions. So in this plot, there's about a 75% chance that you will have less than this straight line amount, maybe about 750,000 acre feet per year of water delivery from the major surface water source. And you might have about a 25% chance of having surplus water above this sort of delivery target of about 750,000 acre feet. So in about 25% of the years, you're going to be trying to think about, well, what can I do with that surplus water? Can I bank it? Can I sell it? Can I exchange it with somebody else? And in the drier years, you're going to be thinking about, well, what can I do in those circumstances? So when I don't have enough surface water, which is usually the cheapest, what else can I do? Can I pump groundwater? Can I fallow some of the annual crops? Can I purchase perhaps very expensive water from a neighboring district to water the trees in the system? So this is sort of an agricultural illustration for how these portfolios fit within a probabilistic context across many different kinds of water use. Quite a few metrics of water supply reliability developed and used for different purposes. You'll hear this term firm yield, which is essentially what is the largest water demand that you can supply with 100% reliability for an exact repeat of the historic record. So the firm yield is not 100% reliability, but it will be 100% reliability for a repeat of the historic record. So if you have a short record, it might not be very much reliability at all. We have percent reliabilities over many years of achieving a fixed, a stated delivery target. We have all kinds of quantitative indices for robustness, resilience, and vulnerability that have different conceptual and numerical equation manifestations. Something I like is sort of what's the expected annual damage. And you can sort of treat it sometimes as an insurance problem in some cases. And then probability distributions of performance. What's the probability distribution of deliveries is, as we saw before, can be quite insightful. Climate
Is it okay
change
to ask a question?
Go, please, go right ahead.
Could you go back to the last slide? I had a question about that estimated annual damages. What do you assume about making substitutions?
Well, if you do it right, you have substitutions in there. So if an urban water area doesn't have enough water, you don't directly go to shorting the highest value use. You'll under some of the worst cases, you would probably go to shorting some of the lower value uses, where the economic damage might be not very much at all, or you might have a deal with a nearby irrigation district that might be growing alfalfa, where you could pay them to fallow land and have very little economic damage from it.
That sounds good. And then how realistic is it to assume good substitution? Like what percentage of this water can really be moved anywhere in the system?
Well, you've seen the plumbing system. It's quite elaborate. So it really matters more if you can find someone that has lower valued water uses that you can make a contract with and get it through the regulations in time to actually get it delivered. So given, certainly for the higher value uses, most of them are pretty assiduous about going out and making contacts and trying to make these kind of arrangements. Certainly the bigger cities all have quite elaborate water shortage management plans, drought management plans, and I think increasingly the agricultural users, certainly the almond orchard folks, are going to be having to think that way.
Okay, thanks. I'll let you keep going now. Sorry.
Okay, so that's good. Please interrupt me. I'm a professor. I'll just drone on otherwise. Climate change is going to have some fairly big effects on water supply reliability. We're expecting to see more floods and droughts, even if the average precipitation stays about the same. And certainly the loss of snowpack is going to have some impacts on water supply reliability as well, although probably less impact than what most people fear. We've got a lot of forms of non-stationarity in the system, not just climate change. We have some changes in the infrastructure deterioration in water quality in some of the larger aquifers. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta itself is a source of non-stationary unreliability in terms of earthquakes and the like, and what they could do to salt intrusion into the Delta. We have non-stationarity in terms of the agricultural water demands, in terms of crop commodity prices, population growth, water conservation actions in cities, non-stationarity in ecosystems, new invasive species, continued degradation in many ways of the ecosystem, non-stationarity in terms of our new chemicals affecting the water quality and new technologies that give us sensors so we can more tightly manage water in some positive ways, and then sort of non-stationarity in terms of the administration, the regulations, the agreements, the funding, the storage policies, infrastructure capacities. All of these, at least conceptually, you would like to see evaluated and considered in water supply reliability studies as much as you can. Some sort of overall issues. Reliability estimates, the process of making reliability estimates force you to integrate knowledge about the system. The water demands, the water supplies, the operations, the capacities, the things that you expect are going to affect that system for the seasonal operations time frame or the longer term planning and policy time frames you have in mind. Certainly there's a lot of uncertainties in that time frame, but just like retirement planning, we still do retirement planning calculations, even though we don't believe all the assumptions completely. There's, I think, some interesting issues of the reliability of components within a water supply system and the reliability of the overall system. You try to have some kinds of redundancy, some kinds of contingency planning, so that your overall system reliability exceeds the reliability of individual components. Although you can have a fairly fragile system where the reliability of the system is much less than the reliability of individual components because you rely upon them in series. The water management portfolio idea, I think, is essential for this, where you try to develop these portfolios of supply and demand management to increase the reliability of the system, even though the components themselves might be individually much less reliable. Again, both the insights and the errors that come out of modeling and the importance of making interpretations of that, thinking about the results to get insights and not believe the numbers too much, and the many forms of non-stationarity that affect this system. Last slide is on the ongoing Science Board review of water supply reliability estimation. There's a substantial partial draft that exists that a few of us are going to continue to work on, even though at a slower rate. We will make some revisions on this and hopefully get to you an internal draft to comment on, hopefully just after they find a way to pay us all. After we're satisfied with the internal draft, we'll put it out for public review for further comment. And often some substantial improvements come with that, as well as further reflections from the Science Board folks. And then we'll see those further comments and revisions, and then have a final report, and then follow-up actions to follow up on the report to make sure people understand what we're saying. Some final ideas to consider. These are a little bit of thoughts reflecting on that report that we've got in draft form now. Environmental water supply reliability is really important, I think, in our considerations for this system in the future and in the present. And since our board is mostly environmental water folks, I would really appreciate it if you all develop thoughts over time on that we can integrate into this report on how do we consider environmental water supply reliability together with human water supply reliability, which has been well developed over the last century. How do we reconcile estimates of reliability from different model users, different models, different modelers, different agencies that might even have a different interest in these numbers? There's some interest in the field about having reliability without probability, essentially robustness kinds of measures. I think there's some interesting discussions to be had around that. How should decision makers consider water supply reliability estimates? We're interested in taking science and seeing how we can make it more useful for decision makers, operators, policymakers, and the like. And then to me, one of the underlying difficulties of the whole subject is that it's important enough that the decimal dust in our errors in our calculations are worth about $1,000 an acre foot during drought. So it's pretty easy to have a few thousand acre feet or tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000 or so acre foot of error in these models that would be basically worth $100 million in a drought year. So the errors are really important. And then because I'm a professor, I'll leave you with some further readings. So I'll stop there. If you have any questions, just let me know.
Jay?
Yes.
This is Bob Nyman. First of all, presentation. Thank you for doing that. I have a kind of a two-part question. Actually, it's probably more of a curiosity. If you were to take a semi-normal year for the Delta in terms of the available water, do you have any idea what percentage of that water would actually leave the Delta as virtual water in products that were produced from it and sent somewhere else? And along the same line, if you were to take the population in the greater Delta, how much virtual water do they import each year in terms of the products that they buy? What's the contrast between the two?
Yeah, I stayed away from the concept of virtual water because it has sort of it has a lot of potential to add more confusion than insight. But it's still it's an interesting concept. Most of the agriculture in this region is for export to other parts of the United States or internationally. Basically, California's economy is pretty heavily globalized, from Hollywood to Silicon Valley to the agriculture. California, I think, is responsible for about 80% of all the almonds on the world market. So, essentially most of the water used in agriculture is exported in that sense, but it's exported very profitably. It makes people in California a lot wealthier than they would be otherwise.
Right. I was just curious as to how it compares, not only in percentage of the available water coming into the Delta, how much is actually exported in crops or other products, and compare that to what is actually being brought into the state from a much larger water footprint that would include, say, Mexico or Arizona or other parts of the world where the water supply is actually more global for California than it is just what's in the Delta's catchment system.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. Certainly, most of the cars that are produced that are used in California are not made in California. So all the water that was used to make the steel in those cars is essentially virtual water imports into California. If you want to look at it that way, most of our breakfast cereal is probably grown in the Midwest with water that was not native to California. So if you want to look at this from a sort of a virtual water balance kind of perspective, you can make this all very complex and wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
But normally the water supply reliability field is looking at, well, specific decisions on operations for this water system in California for purposes of economic, human, and environmental purposes. And I'm not sure that the virtual water framework is very insightful for those management purposes, but it is very interesting.
Yeah. Oh, great. Well, thank you.
Any other
Okay.
questions?
This is Diana. Can I ask another follow-up question? Is that all right? So I was really interested in the graph showing economic value versus percent use for agriculture, the ones with the showing how important the almonds were, for example. And yeah, that one. And I was wondering if you were to do a graph like that for environmental water use, could you associate some water use, say, with the Endangered Species Act and some with the Clean Water Act or state regulations? Is that a way to attribute the economic value of the water that's being used for maintaining, say, a population of endangered fish? Is that a good, maybe that's not a good question.
Well, Lisa can probably go into the literature on the economic valuation of the existence value of different kinds of fish. There's a lot of literature that attempts to do that or explores doing that. I think there is, in principle, some valuation that a society will put on these environmental resources, but I don't think we've gained a lot of consensus as to exactly how to quantify that. We're kind of fortunate in the agricultural sector in particular, where most of this agriculture is a business, right? And so for a business, you can use market values as a way of benchmarking the economic value of that water use as an input to commercial agriculture. And you can do fairly similar things for coming up with, you know, pretty reasonable economic values of urban water use.
Yeah, I think what, if I may just add a bit here, I think what Diane might be getting at is she's kind of getting at the embodied water, if you will, in a fish as a way to value it. I think you may be interested to know that there is a legally defined value to assign to salmon for the purposes of water allocation. So while economists may argue about that number, there is a number that California uses. So, but only for salmon, only for the endangered salmon.
So one of my general questions is, which of these regulatory frameworks, say the Endangered Species Act versus the Clean Water Act, is having the largest impact in terms of these environmental needs or uses of water? Is that known?
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting studies for the Delta that have looked at the last, say, 20 years of Delta outflows and traced back, well, why did that water flow out to sea? For a lot of it during flood years, there just basically wasn't enough capacity to capture all of it. But during the low flow years, there has to be some amount of water that would flow out the Delta just to keep saline intrusion from coming in to the water users and the water export facilities that are in the Delta. And if you add increments to that for how much additional water has to go out of the Delta in order to meet Endangered Species Act kind of requirements, it's actually a fairly small amount of water. Although it tends to be in drought periods, so the economic impacts are felt fairly directly.
Thanks.
Jay, this is Jim. I really appreciated this talk. I'm a Californian, and I know that one of the two co-equal goals is improved water supply reliability, but I have no idea what that means. And I think your table of the metrics of reliability was really helpful. My question is, and I don't think this is going to be in your report, but it's something that we need to be aware of, is what kinds of actions are feasible for improving reliability? And I know that one of them is not damming more rivers.
Well, yeah, there's of course, a large literature that looks at the relative improvements in reliability that you get for each of those kind of actions that are in that portfolio table, which might include damming more rivers in principle. From the analyses that I've been part of, we see very little, relatively little improvements in water supply reliability from most storage expansions. Far less than I think is the popular understanding. Any additional questions?
I just had a quick question. Could you go to your, I think it was like your second to last slide, you were talking about the robustness issue that kind of piqued my interest. I was hoping you could just speak a little, go back. No, keep going, sorry. It was second to last.
Oh, there we go. This one here.
Yeah, number 3. I was just hoping you could kind of talk a little bit more about that, what you mean by that. And
I think this is a really interesting issue, and I'm not quite sure exactly what I think about it, but the probabilities are always slippery creatures, right? And you get into a lot of controversy about how to estimate probabilities. Maybe some of you have tried to estimate probabilities from data. And so there's now a school of thought that basically says, well, why don't we just look at the reliability of this system for a whole bunch of different random scenarios, a very wide range of random scenarios, and we'll use that as our standard and not calculate probabilities. And I can see some insights that come out of that in the sense that you should always listen to probabilities, but you shouldn't always believe them. And you should be prepared for extremes even though they're improbable, or need to think about preparing for extremes even though they're improbable. So I think this sort of robustness philosophy is very useful for helping people think how they would respond to improbable events that might have large consequences. Even though from a probabilistic perspective, it might be unwise to invest a lot in preparing for them up front. So,
Can I add just one?
That you might want to do a combination of probabilistic as well as sort of extreme scenario, worst case kind of planning.
Can I add just one thought to that? And maybe Tanya already knows this, and that's why she picked up on this, but one of the potential uses of robustness analysis is to say, okay, we have based on all the probabilities that we've estimated, our best guess is this is what the future looks like, and here's our optimal solution for that best guess. But the robustness analysis might say, you know, that is the best if we're right, but it's not the best if we're wrong. And so that's what the scenario exploration allows you to see, is that maybe you want to back away from that one optimum if you can you're more likely to generate net benefits over a range of outcomes.
Yes, that's right. And so a true devotee of the probabilistic school would say, well, you should really be doing a two-stage optimization that incorporates your unreliability of your probabilities.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. We're right on time, and thanks, Jay. That's exactly what we needed. Any public comment on this? Edmund? Okay, Edmund's on mute, but I don't hearing nobody about public comments. We're scheduled for a short break, and let's take that and reconvene sharply at 12 or at 40 minutes past the hour, and we'll get ready in between then.
Okay, very good. Thanks for the great questions.
Edmund, are you there?
I am, but I don't think you can hear me.
I can hear you now.
Hello? Okay.
I can hear you now.
Hello?
Hi. Edmund, can you share your screen?
Yeah.
Okay, we're moving on to item number 4 on the agenda, which is to look at the Science Needs Assessment Workshop and Science Needs Assessment Report. This is something that is a joint effort with the Delta Independent Science Board and the DPIIC. And as such, as a partnership, it is moving along on its own timescale, but it is something that we think that we would like to get the full board's participation in, and particularly get their input and endorsement of our recommendations and report by the end of the year. And so what I'd like to do today is, and Jay and I have been taking and Dick from the previous board, been taking the representing the board on this activity. And what I'd like to do today is just to give you a background of how we got here, what it entails, where we're going with this, and what the time frame might be, and go from there. So the next slide, we call it the long-term science needs assessment. And this really started out with a letter that we wrote to DPIIC in February of last year. DPIIC is, I think, the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, but it's basically a group of agency heads that work within the council. At the time, DPIIC was underdoing a sort of a science funding and governance initiative, and we sent this letter to DPIIC suggesting that they needed to do a strategic science needs assessment, and I'll get more into that. And they adopted that and endorsed our recommendation and put that forward as part of their formal priorities. And we sent them a memo as late as this past April to give them an update on the status of where we are with our work. The next slide. So what we said in our memo to DPIIC, I don't think we've ever written a memo or letter to DPIIC, and this was an idea that was initially started by Dick, but it soon caught on for the full board, and we felt it was necessary to send a letter directly to DPIIC to encourage some action. And what we entitled that letter, subject matter was the urgency and opportunities for improving Delta interagency science and technology integration. So it was really revolved around the need to have for that integration component. We pointed out that environmental conditions are changing at an increasing rate, and particularly with respect to climate change, but also with the expectation of new invasive species, shifts in land use, and increasing demands for water. This is not just within the Delta, but globally this is being observed, but certainly within the Delta, it's an important issue to look at. And what we specifically suggested in that letter is we needed a bolder, forward-looking, and better integrated science program to address these Delta challenges, which routinely span the mandates of multiple agencies. And I think that's a very important component of that recommendation. We suggest that it's going to require science leadership and vision, some real identification of major scientific priorities in the Delta, and I underline priorities and major, and then to explore the current structures to greatly enhance interagency science integration. So the next slide. So one of the things we suggested they do is to do a comprehensive science needs assessment. And the components of that we felt were important in that letter were that it should be based on a fundamental system-wide scientific and management challenges facing the Delta, that we should identify future Delta conditions and changes in fundamental driving forces with a focus on climate change. We needed to identify science needs to forecast and predict how the Delta might change under these conditions. That process we suggested needs to include stakeholder engagement, and hopefully would lead to a multi-agency effort that would provide that leadership and an effective structure for creative science and technology integration. The next slide. As part of that, there was I think it's a 15 person planning team that was created, and team's been working for now well over a year in trying to develop that science needs assessment and focus largely on a workshop. And this is just a list of the members of that planning team. But more importantly, the photos on the right are photos of board member field trips within the Delta. And hopefully someday you will all get to experience some of that, but those are actual board members learning things. So next slide. So what we did is, as part of the process, we created a briefing paper which outlined, again, the need for the scientific assessment, what's been done in the past, how that relates to kind of existing other efforts within the Delta planning and Delta science planning agenda, and outline what would be the essential components of doing that scientific needs assessment. That it was originally planned to have the workshop in April, but given COVID, that was rescheduled till October. Excuse me. But what we decided to do to keep the momentum rolling was to have 4 discussion sessions that would deal with each of the 4 topics that were identified as part of the essential component of that science needs assessment. Sort of on a parallel track, the board continued to work on a separate paper, which was to look at preparing for a fast forward future in the Delta. And that paper was exploring the various options that are related to rapid change. We had 2 panels, I think, on the topic, and they had a lot of their input on that. That paper has now been submitted, just recently has been submitted. But that's a parallel effort, and we want to make sure that what we're proposing in the science needs assessment really takes account of what we were pointing out as well in that scientific paper. The focal point was a scientific needs assessment workshop, which was held on October 5th and 6th. And I know that Tom and Jay and I were there, and Lisa, I think, was there as well. Our goal is to finish the final report in early 2021. It could be as early as January. And then we will make those recommendations specifically to DPIIC, which is the group that endorsed us, but also try and incorporate it into something called the Science Action Agenda for really their strategic or longer term priorities within that more, I want to say, shorter term focused document. I'll explain how those are related a little bit in a little while. The next slide. So the 4 topic areas we looked at are shown here. And in each of these, we had sort of a panel discussion and Mentimeter questions for the participants in that discussion group. First question was, what do we know about projected climate changes impacts in the Delta? And then given that, what questions does that raise for management decisions? What do managers need to know in that context? Then thirdly, given what managers need to know, what science needs to be done to meet management needs? And then finally, given that we know what the science priorities are, what changes, if any, are needed for science governance funding and the necessary integration? Each of these discussion groups had, I think, over 100 participants in each one. So there was a lot of engagement of people. We had Mentimeter questions and which gave stakeholder input on a lot of the issues we were discussing as well, stakeholder in the broadest sense of that term. I believe they're all available for you to watch if you have absolutely nothing better to do. You can watch all of those. We're also writing summary reports that summarizes and graphs some of the responses we got from each of the various discussion groups. The next slide And the so this is a summary of some of these discussion groups, and I'm just going to go through these extremely briefly. There's a lot of recurrent themes that come up in a lot of these various discussions. John Calloway, the former science lead, led the discussion on climate change, and this is some of the things he talked about. That some of the key mechanisms for Delta climate change impacts are, of course, increased air and water temperature, precipitation and runoff, sea level rise, and he also said about the increased summer duration, things like that, changes in the seasonal timing. There's a lot of discussion about the time frames that we need to talk about. Do we need to talk about things now, 10 years from now, 20 years, 50 years from now? And the answer is basically yes, and that certain changes are occurring right now induced by climate, and that we need to anticipate what might change, but also be prepared for surprises. There was also a discussion that other drivers cannot be forgotten, and there is an interrelationship between those drivers and the human responses. And then finally, that we do have capabilities right now to be able to forecast what some of those changes might be and what some of those impacts beyond that might be. The next slide was the second workshop to talk about what do managers need to know. And these are the folks that were on the panel, and there was a good discussion that said that managers need community buy-in. They need to have strong science to guide their funding. We need to develop a collaboratively developed overarching set of strategic management questions to guide Delta science, and then be able to respond to uncertainties that will unlock necessary research questions. The next slide is to look at what some of the participant input might be on those topics. And there was suggestions that we needed a synthesis, both monitoring information and how implementation projects, the effects of them. A lot of discussion and input throughout on the need for forecasting and prediction tools. Look at the synergistic effect of changes, prioritization with trade-offs and risks, social science, and experiments that need to be derived from management actions such as adaptive management. I think our view is that the participant report we got from these discussions was extremely valuable, extremely thoughtful, and extremely, it came from people that really know the system well. And I think it was a high level input, and I think we're all very happy with what we got. And I'm glossing this over quite a bit. The next slide is the third topic, which really focused in on what the science needs are to meet those management needs. Certainly we need strategic science goals, and again, to develop and improve tools, forecasting and data infrastructure. There was a lot of discussion that we needed to better understand ecosystem processes at the mechanistic level, and food webs and food web drivers was a component of that. That management options and analysis of regulation effects, again, human dimensions, social economic impacts, and then again, look at the future impacts of climate change on some Delta processes. The next slide. And finally, we spent a day talking, or an hour, these were less than an hour discussion groups, talking about the need for science governance, funding, and integration. And the panelists thought we needed coordination, recognizing that the broad goals, there are broader goals that go outside of the more confined regulatory mandated science realm. Leadership is required within agencies as well as throughout and across agencies. And there's, of course, the need for science communication between scientists and managers. The next slide, and this is from the participant input, is that these are some of the things that are also required: trust among participants, leadership, institutional structure, reliable funding, and again, leadership. Okay, the next slide. So that was the background to the workshop, and the actual workshop itself was 2 days long, or 2 half-a-days, and it really focused on those last 2 discussion groups. We focused, one of the goals was to identify the key science needs, capacities, tools that will provide answers and insights for likely management questions under a changing Delta. We spent a half a day discussing that particular topic. What are the scientific needs and tools that we really have to have? And then the other half of the workshop was to discuss then, given that scientific needs, how do we organize the science enterprise to better address these more complex and changing problems that span individual agency mandates. The workshop itself, again, was 2 half-days. I believe it was it was recorded. The primary plenary sessions were recorded. They're also available to look at. And of course, we're producing reports that summarize the various discussions. I'll go a little bit into how the workshop was run to give you a flavor for the kind of input we received. On the next slide, we had a plenary panel first, and we asked these folks, what is your advice on developing a science needs assessment? And how can we make the science needs assessment effective for policymakers? Some of these folks you may know. Peter Goodwin was the former science lead. And the input we got from these individuals was really outstanding from my point of view. They really set the stage nice and created, their job was to create enthusiasm amongst the participants. I think we had over 140, I might be wrong, but it's very close to over 140 participants in the 2-day workshop. And we charged our plenary speakers to incite creative thinking, and I think that's exactly what they did, because we got some really good input from the breakout groups. The next slide. So on day 1, we talked about science and said, what do we need to know to support future decisions from a scientific point of view? What kind of tools and capabilities? We broke it up into 8 work groups that are topically oriented: water supply, food management, habitat, native and non-native species, water quality, land use, and Delta as an evolving place. And within each of these groups, we asked them to put together, we asked them a series of 4 questions. I don't know if I have those. The next slide. Yeah, these were the questions that we asked within the breakout groups, particularly related to what can we do better to prepare our scientific enterprise to support management decisions, and do we have the right research, monitoring, modeling, decision support capabilities, or do we need new tools? And what scientific capabilities in particular do we need so that science can prepare for problems that will arise with future environmental change? So the focus was on climate, the focus was on environmental change, and the focus in this particular day was to talk about the science capabilities themselves. The results from these various 8 working groups, we have the raw notes. There's about 58 pages of raw notes. And so we had a lot of feedback and a lot of enthusiasm, I believe. And the next slide. All right, then day 2, we zeroed in more about looking at the science enterprise as a whole. How could we, and we divided in the groups that dealt with coordination, funding, institutional change, science enterprise leadership, and data management, and asked the question, the broad question of how do we develop a structure to support and encourage and accomplish sort of these larger scale logistics science needs that we've been talking about. The next slide. And I thank Cheryl for doing this, but this is putting together the 58 pages from day 1 and countless pages on day 2 into one slide. But to give you a flavor of some of the points that were raised, one of them was that many of the groups talked about was creating a collaboratory. This was an idea that Peter Goodwin actually suggested in his plenary, and it caught on as a term, and a lot of discussion about what that meant and how that might work and what would be the value, advantages, and disadvantages. And you can read through these, but a lot of these relate to particularly to the science enterprise activities, stable funding, increasing coordination, having leadership, and thinking about going incremental, having viewing the governance holistically. And when you get down to the science, a lot of it was just focused on the developing better forecasting, integrated modeling tools, and of course, making sure that we're looking at the data that we are collecting and the data that we are collecting in conjunction with decision support modeling, I guess the best way to say it. So next slide. So I know I went through that very quickly, and you're more than welcome to review the documents and that we produce, but our challenge right now is to review the workshop and the various discussions input. Mike Chakowski and I are presenting DPIIC with just sort of a preliminary status report on October 26th. And then we're putting together a draft report and then a final report. As I said, our recommendations will go to DPIIC and to the science action agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit more how we're going to really do this in a slide or two, but I do want to make this, you might hear about the science action agenda, and I want to, that's a formal part of what the planning process within the Delta science program. And every 4 years, they produce something called a science action agenda. And that's designed to set forward some of the priorities for, I want to say, for the near term of what the science is being done. They review that every 4 years. It's done with extreme, I know I'm going to do this a disservice in describing this, but it's done with extreme amount of input from stakeholders. They had their workshop a week before ours, their first workshop. They have a 1-year process to develop that. And they start out with surveys and so forth. I think now they have something like 1,200 or maybe 1,500 questions and topics and priorities. And their goal is to move from that down to a reasonable amount by setting priorities, condensing multiple similar objectives into one, and a variety of processes to narrow that scope down into something doable. I think we're kind of taking just the opposite tact. And I think when we talk about how we're going to write ours, we're going to start out with these are the big ideas and these will need to be done, and start just throw those out there in a sense. The next slide kind of explains this a little bit differently. Our result, if you look at the top bar, it's sort of the science action agenda, asking the question, scientifically, what do we need to do now under current conditions? And when we're talking about a science needs assessment, is that we're looking, what kind of science do we need when there are changes in environmental conditions and environmental drivers? Some of those changes are, of course, occurring now. Some of that science we need to have done needs to start now, but it's more of a strategic look, and there's no time scale on here because we don't know what the time scale is. Things are happening now, and some of the stuff we've said the urgency is we need to start that science now. The time scale is when decisions will be made. And this is sort of one way to look at the connection between those. Clearly, our science needs assessment recommendations, which we expect to get done in early 2021, will feed into the science action agenda and help them steer their ship when considering strategic priorities. I think their timeline is to get done sometime towards the end of next year in terms of their next report. And another way that I look at this more individually is the next slide. This is a little complex, but it might give you some idea. The science action agenda might take something like bass predation on salmon. There are striped bass and largemouth bass that feed on salmon, and the question is how big of a problem is that, and what can we do about it? From a science needs assessment perspective is that we know there's going to be climate warming, which is going to raise the temperatures and lengthen the seasons. Well, that's going to affect the salmon. It's going to affect the bass individual populations. It's also going to affect their spatial distribution and predation rates. So if we really want to understand how that relationship is going to change and what management can do about it, you need to consider how the environmental drivers are and will change that relationship. So anyway, that's sort of just a fish person's viewpoint of how they differ. Next slide. Now, I certainly don't expect, this is just the first introduction. We plan to have a lot of this stuff kind of written up so you can actually spend some time thinking about it. But this is a very, very rough draft of what our report's going to look like. And the important point on here is what we've decided to do is take all of that information that we've gotten and come up with what we're going to call 3 to 5 strategic and bold science priorities based on all of that. It might be, you know, we're going to have a priority to, you know, forecast something to do with food webs under the context of a changing environment or something like that. That will require a scientific coordinated effort. It's bold. It's something we don't have, but it will have immediate value to management now as well as in the future. And we want to take all of that material we've gotten and come up with 3 to 5 major bold topics, and then work through how that would be done, what kind of organization, funding, scientific enterprise structure could make that kind of thing happen. Something that stakeholders would immediately see the value of, scientists would see the real need for it, and it would lead to a natural, or at least let's say natural integration and coordination and cooperation. And that's the kind of recommendation we want to make to DPIIC. We've asked Tom to join our writing team, and it's Jay and I and Tom right now. And so our goal is in the next 2 to 4 weeks to put together this this part of the of a draft report, and then hopefully with back and forth and massaging to get it to the board in time for our December meeting. And what we'd be asking the board to do is to hopefully by that time put in sufficient time to endorse our recommendations. I think that's kind of where we stand on this right now. And I'll talk a little bit more about time allocation and priorities when we get on to the next subject. But right now, that's where this is one of the areas where we're really looking for board input on this particular science needs assessment, because we're the ones that initiated and triggered the activity. So Jay, what do you think? What did I miss?
Well, I think that's a pretty good summary. This is a really rare opportunity for the board to comment at a pretty high level on the structure of science for the Delta and directions for it. So I think, you know, for this group, where so many of you have so much experience in the organization of science in a variety of situations, I think you as individuals and collectively have a lot of wisdom that I think we want to tap as much as you have time to provide. It's really unfortunate to me that we have this awful compensation condition in the short term, but hopefully hopefully this gets resolved quick enough that you have more time for it.
Yes, Bob.
Just a question, Jay. First of all, thank you. That was a great overview, you know, of this activity, and it looks like a lot of effort has gone into it already. And it also, I think, gives me some good insights into, I would say, the science enterprise that's being shaped, you know, going forward. But I do have one question out of curiosity. How much effort or discussion was done on achievable future conditions so that the science enterprise can actually begin to match what might be achievable in the next few decades. Anyway, I'd be interested in hearing more about that, just because there's so many things that need to be done, so many of them, that it's probably going to be very important to pick ones where a difference can be made. And does that, the science enterprise focus on those, or is it something broader and larger that is really just trying to develop a sustainable, resilient ecological system?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Bob. That's exactly the kind of things we're looking for. Something that is that captures the attention of something like DPIIC and the management agencies, that this is something to put their time and effort in the management community. It's going to be something that's valuable and doable, And I think the doable part is a bit more of a challenge, because if it's doable under present day structure and resources and priority setting, that's going to have a limitation. We want to be able to generate something, at least in my view, that is so captivating that it actually forces the science enterprise to mold around it and move forward to achieve it, and hopefully attract funding to do it and things like that. It has to be doable and has to be recognized, doable and valuable. Jay, what do you think?
I think that's true. The audience for this document, I think, is twofold. One is it's the scientists themselves, for us to think about how to manage our careers and the little programs that we're working on. But the bigger audience is the real policymakers, the agency leaders that are making budgetary decisions and decisions on directions. I think to bring both of those groups along together with one document is pretty important. You want to have them all on the same page at the high level and at the day-to-day level. To get them there, I think, as with most persuasive documents, you need to have it be a little bit like a religious ceremony where you have both doom and redemption. Doom if we don't make these kind of changes, then we're really not on track to be adaptive for the kind of delta that we're expecting. And then redemption, in that there are some things that we can do to make things a lot better.
Steve, could I add something?
Sure.
It partly in response to Bob's point, but one of the things that I learned from the workshops and the presentations was there was a lot of discussion of governance and organization, the end of the report. There was probably more discussion of that than the science itself. And I think it was pretty clear to me, and when Peter Goodwin was advocating the Collaboratory, I was thinking, well, that's probably not good enough to accomplish the integration of what we're doing. So that one place where the whole board could be of great benefit, I think, is based on their experience in where they've been in groups with addressing large complex problems that are very multidisciplinary. How do you organize that effort in a coherent way? It was very interesting listening to the regional director for BUREC, who's an attorney by background, and he was talking about contracts and that kind of stuff. And he gave a very simple message to have the scientists work together. So it seemed to me he was telling us he wasn't hearing a coherent message, and how we govern ourselves in a way that we can come up with a true multidisciplinary effort is a big challenge. And I think that's one place where maybe the whole board could give us some assistance.
So this is Joe. Just a question I plan to look at the videos. I haven't had time yet. In fact, Edmund sent it to us graciously. And is there any kind of consensus emerge about what are the critical science needs in the workshop?
I think there was a common threads, I would call it, ranging from our discussion groups to output that came through the workshop itself and the breakout groups. And clearly things like having forecasting capabilities and forecasting and modeling, I think, was one. And certainly the linkage, there seemed to be a lot of discussion of the linkages to the monitoring data, and both linkages of those activities as well as making sure that the monitoring data is available and relevant. And those are at least two of the themes that I thought, but that is one of the challenges we'll have, is to go through and see if there's some other ones that might come out of this. I want to respond a little bit to Bob too, is that maybe Edmund, you can put the next slide on, is that Jay and I have talked about this as well, and possibly taking, once we have these ideas that Joe is talking about, and then have some framework for them, we might, before we just present them to DPIIC, is to go and individually carry them to various agency heads and have a chat and basically ask the kind of question that that you've asked, Bob. Is this something that is doable? Is this something that could be gain traction, or is this something that is has some flaws to it? And how would we actually make this into something that is more actionable? This, by the way, is the slide from Peter Goodwin that did stimulate a lot of discussion, and the collaboratory aspect of it came out in a lot of the various groups, but Peter sold it well. So.
Well, I think this is a great idea. And it's something that we have, the science boards in the Columbia have proposed. We don't have a lot of traction yet for various reasons, but it's something like this that I believe is really needed. So I'll leave it at that, and we can discuss this in more detail later on.
It seemed to me that there was a lot of interest in this idea of a collaboratory or some other kind of framework that would allow scientists from different agencies and academia to sort of all work together on some of these problems. But there was also, I think, a reasonable amount of institutional skepticism that any agency would let its best scientists go off and do something somewhere else rather than working at home, so to speak, in the home agency.
Was one of the ideas to really think about defining problems and then perhaps opening the box a bit in terms of what the scientific solutions might be? Because I find as a social scientist, many people have less familiarity with our capabilities. And so they come with a very specific ask. And then I have to back them up and say, well, what are you trying to solve? And then we might have some other ideas. Maybe what they suggested initially is exactly the right thing, but also it's possible there are other ways to meet their need. And so I would hope that there would be room for that kind of conversation.
Sounds like good engineering.
Yeah, and Jay is an engineer, and me as a fish guy have been having, his first outline was the word problem, and there was, I think, in every chapter heading. I changed it to more science. So I think we're right in the middle of that conversation. Yes, Tanya?
Yeah, on the governance side, there is literature out there that's looked at the design of collaborative science processes, whether from epistemic communities or collaborative governance mechanisms that engage substantially with science communities. So it might be worth pulling drawings from some of that literature for that section of the report somehow to at least look at what some of those other options are that have been explored in some of the institutional design mechanisms that might be important to take into account for the success of this type of endeavor. You know, of course, every system is unique, so there's challenges in the Delta that, you know, you won't find in other places and vice versa, but there could be some interesting lessons there that we could draw from.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya.
Some papers describing that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I can help with that.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention that Mark Lubel is your colleague, is he's taking the lead in writing the governance part of this. After we give him what the problem/solutions are all about, then he can tell us how to govern. So did I see Diane?
Yeah.
Diane?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on a bit of a different topic. I saw that one of the headings was the science expertise needs in the future. And I was wondering if there was a discussion of the importance of developing and training young scientists now to be doing this kind of integrated multidisciplinary work later on in their career, and the need to have, or the benefit of having enhanced quantitative training in some fields, and looking forward in that way, that the scientific enterprise includes a scientist. And I know in many universities and elsewhere, there's discussion about the importance of enhancing the diversity in STEM education, and that might be an opportunity to bring in that topic as well, especially in the context of helping scientists and engineers be aware of processes related to stakeholder engagement. So I wanted to see if that came up, and maybe that's there's a point in this report where we could bring some of those ideas forward.
I agree. I think that's very important. And some of the discussions on the collaboratories or different variants on that idea have seen this as a very important vehicle for trying to bring the agency cultures a little bit together by educating people together and getting some cross-fertilization across agencies.
We might have some words to encourage funding of internships for undergraduates and graduate students, and exchange of experience in different ways. And certainly NSF is doing that with this intern program for people who have NSF support. So I think this would be beneficial to bring in.
Well, all of these agencies are going through what they call the silver tsunami of retirements. And so many of them are very keen to fill up their pipelines.
So in that regard, I'm working with an NSF team. It's called Engage in Fuse, where Fuse is Food, Energy, Water Systems. And that team is coming up with best practices for stakeholder engagement. And so hopefully in a month or so, I could share the approach that group is supporting. And then also, I was really surprised. I listened carefully. I don't think you used the word communication in any of this. And to me, it seems effective communication between all of these teams. And I like this last slide you're showing, because enabling technology to collaborate, access multiple models, data synthesis, and visualization addresses that. But so many of our challenges are related to effective communication of the science, effective communication of the management needs. And that deals with terminology, different traditions we have in our sciences and so forth. So I see that as a big part or an element of this collaboratory.
Good.
All great ideas. Okay, so we're closing up on the time on this one. And before we close, I wanted to again remind folks of a little bit of the timeline. And so save your hours from late November and into December, your volunteer hours, and we'll devote them towards this particular report, okay? And so if there's nothing further, I ask if there's any public comment on this.
There are none.
Okay, let me talk about then, we'll move on to item 5, which is preparation for upcoming meetings. One of the other reports that we have near completion is the invasive species or non-native species report. So after we look at the total number of hours we have currently available, it seems like this is something we could finish off. And so what I'd like to suggest is that folks take their, whatever's left of their October hours and November hours, and focus them in on the non-native species report. Lisa and I have taken your comments that we received from the last meeting. Those comments related to including microbes, and I think Tom has written a section for that, Tom Holzer, to have a more positive spin on the report, to tailor some of the management questions, to tailor some of the recommendations to particularly those folks that might do it if it's appropriate, to think about prioritization of the recommendations, and to consider an executive summary. So we're in the process of redrafting that, and hopefully we'll have that redrafted mid next week and available to you to look at. And it doesn't have a lot of, I wouldn't say content has changed the way I define content, which is the core recommendations. And the idea would be for then to each of you to have a look at it. And what we'd like to do is at our next meeting, November 13th, that we would spend 1 hour talking about this report and seeing if we can get content approval. And what we mean by content approval is usually the way we have to, in order for a review to go forward and make our presentation to the council, we need to have it approved by a vote of the board. And that is usually, often we do it on the basis of a content approval. And what that means is that we approve the content, which is like the basic format, the basic recommendations, and that we may not be happy with the edits, or there may be, and you're all welcome then to add more edits as long as it doesn't change the content, or someone may have some other suggestions that structure or things like that. And then what you would do is give a content approval with a task to the writing team to take those your changes and edits and so forth and move forward with it, but don't change the content. And that way we could go to a formal approval and a product. You're allowed to vote when you vote yes for approval. You can abstain if you don't feel you've had the opportunity to really evaluate this. We do need a majority to move it forward, or to say no. And you're also willing to you're also able to write a minority opinion. I don't know that we've ever had a minority opinion, but you're certainly able to do that. It's in our guidance. Hopefully we can reach to a point where we can get that done. So I think with most everyone on here have sufficient hours between now and November 13th to review what you might get next week. So I'm going to suggest you take all your volunteer hours, devote them towards this for that time. We put forward a vote on it in November 13th. And then you can take your remaining hours in November and anything you have in December. If we're still under this, I almost said quarantine, if we're still under this compensation issue, and take your remaining November and December hours and focus it on the science needs assessment review and endorsement. So for our next meeting in November, we would have 2 hours, and 1 hour would be devoted towards this. I think that the second hour is we would take another topic and explore it. We've talked about, we did the one of the co-equal goals. So the suggestion last time was to do one of the other ones, ecosystem/food webs, and maybe look at that as one of our another exploratory topics like we have today with the water supply reliability. And to jump ahead, then in December during our 2 hours, we would take 1 hour and review the science needs assessment and see if we're ready to endorse that. And then take a second hour on another topic. The topics that have been suggested so far for that December meeting are HABs, habitat restoration, or Delta ISB place. That's still, we can still change those, of course. So anyway, that's what we're thinking about. I've talked to Jim about possibly taking the lead on this. And he's agreed, first he agreed to take the lead, and then I think he agreed to be a co-panelist. And so what we're thinking about is maybe bringing in 3 people and have a panel discussion on this topic, and for half an hour, and then a half an hour of an open discussion. We've talked about Wim Kimmerer, and of course Jim as being a panelist, and Ted Summers being another one. And I know some of you don't know those folks, but they're clearly the people that are working on this. So I guess I'm looking for any thoughts on what that second topic is? Any suggestions of how we might do it, where we might go? Are we asking too much about invasives and science needs, or now's your time? So by no objection, we get full approval. Is that what I'm reading?
Are we asking too much of your time? I guess that's probably the bottom line.
Say that again, Jay.
Are we asking too much of your time as the bottom line?
And are you okay with us sort of giving you some suggested priorities?
It's really helpful to have clear, we need you to do this, because some of us are academics and we're juggling stressed out students and all sorts of other things. So clear directions, do this by this date is really helpful.
Having read the invasive species report recently, one suggestion would be to really highlight the recommendations and try to just get buy-in on the recommendations. I think that would really reduce the amount of time required, because it is a fairly lengthy report. But if people just wanted to see if they agreed with the recommendations, that's kind of the meat of what would move out into the larger community.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, because when we think about a content approval, it is sort of, I guess, sort of just a feeling for the report. Is it sort of like cover the right stuff? But more importantly, are the recommendations, and there's also findings. If there's any findings that's completely objectionable, and they're bulletized in the report, and the recommendations are highlighted. There are only 10 recommendations, and they're 1 or 2 sentences long, followed by a short paragraph in each of those. And we do have a table of contents, I believe, which can point out where those are. And we're thinking of putting together an executive summary, which would have all of the content probably in it, maybe not the details in the findings, because the findings are kind of like, this is the definition of non-native or invasive species. They're not really earth-shattering findings in many respects. But that would be good. And that would be when we send those out for you to look at, we send the report out, we will try and give you some guidance on particularly what to pay attention to.
Steve, I don't think I can contribute much by reading this again. I mean, the major comment and reaction that I had was that 10 recommendations, 10 good recommendations is daunting. And I think the report would have greater impact if some level of prioritization could be done. I don't know how to do that. But to make it a really useful document, I think 10 recommendations is overwhelming. And I think that the consumers of this would really appreciate some guidance on where to start. Pick one and let's start there. I don't have anything more to say about the report other than that.
In terms of overall impact, if you can get the agencies to do one thing, that's pretty good.
Exactly. That's success.
So maybe we should pick that 1 or 2 or 3 to choose from. Yeah, I think that's a good advice. In terms of process, historically, I don't think we've ever had a non-unanimous report. And everybody's felt free to contribute to any report. This content approval process that we've come to is basically a way of saving us all from death by wordsmithing, because being academics, we can do that, but we don't need to prove it anymore.
Okay, I think we were looking at that prioritization of recommendations as we're looking at that. I still feel a bit of a challenge as to how to do that, although something comes to mind immediately is that we can go ahead and do that, and then you can agree whether or not those are the top ones to look at.
Yeah.
And the way I'm looking at Lisa, because I'm looking at you all, but I'm looking at Lisa in particular, she's helping me write this, is that we have recommendations related to individual species approaches, and I think in some respects that's kind of an outdated approach, and there may be recommendations relative to that, but the more important recommendations are the ones that say think bigger and think more differently about a changing species pool. So I can see us putting something up there and let's all debate it next time we meet. Anything else? Input on that?
Just one thought, and Jim, I don't know what you know about the agencies that work on invasive species, but the challenge in my head right now is we may, as scientists, feel that certain things are a priority, but the agencies may just not feel that's within their scope, and they may prefer something that's lower down our priority list as something tractable for them. So I'm wondering if there's any way to feel that out.
You know, an easy solution to this problem, but maybe not a satisfactory one, is to end the report with an acknowledgement that these are all valuable recommendations, but it's not feasible to attack all of them. So the next step following this report could be to reach out to those agencies and ask for their input and guidance about how to do that prioritization process.
Or we could pick one agency for each recommendation and say, this is our recommendation for you. That's not likely to work, but sometimes it helps.
Well, we do have at least 2 of the recommendations now that are targeted towards a specific entity. And, you know, and that, I don't know if that necessarily makes it higher or lower priority, but it's one that only one entity is being recommended to do that. And maybe that'll help sift a little bit through this. By the way, that one entity is the Delta Interagency Invasive Species Coordination Team. And I failed to mention that I was asked to attend that meeting on October 8th and participated in a panel on the early detection and rapid response. They clearly are a multiple agency entity, and they did raise some of the issues that we've raised in terms of who's in charge when it comes to some of these activities, and they're well along in terms of trying to do that, some of the coordination that we're proposing. So anyway, that if anybody has any, those that have read it or those that have a strong interest in looking at those recommendations on which ones might rise to the surface as priority or an entity, just let us know. Virginia?
Well, I just wanted to say, although it's really important to have priorities, I'm a little worried because of the fact that politics and technology changes and demand and, you know, large and frequent events change those priorities very quickly. And so being flexible is highly valuable in this dynamic world. And so we just need to be cognizant of that.
Good point.
Right. Again, our priorities are designed to be science. We're doing a science review, and I know they're tightly intertwined with the management priorities, but there are some key science needs as well that will be there under any threat of an invasive one way or another.
So you can send us the current draft, and then we'll send comments.
Yeah, you have the September 8th draft, which is the one we're working on, and but we will hopefully get you a revised version of that, which is sometime next week.
Good.
Any other thoughts or comments on our way forward and our meetings and so forth? Things will change. If the compensation issue is fully resolved, we can then reconsider where we are and where we're going. Okay, well, thank you. Is there any public comment on that topic?
There are none.
Okay, Edmund, I think it's up to you next to just review if there's any action items.
Yes, so there are a few. So as you mentioned earlier, Steve, the ISB members should devote their remaining volunteer hours on the ecosystems review. Any suggestions on prioritization of the recommendations for the review are appreciated. So just send those to staff. And then hopefully the ISB members will get a report for content approval sometime next week. And then the rest of the hours in terms of the volunteer hours that members are willing to commit should be focused on the science needs assessment. And you guys are targeting a report for discussion in December. And then you also have, for ISB members who have no life, those are your words, Steve. They have videos that they can watch of all 4 science needs assessment seminars and also of the workshop. And we have some minor individual items. I think, Tanya, you mentioned potentially sharing some governance articles to help inform the SNA. And I think Virginia mentioned that she's working on some stakeholder engagement efforts that may be useful for this effort. So I know we're a little over time, but that's the main items I have for this meeting.
Very good, Edmund. Well, any public comments for those, item number 7, public comments for those matters that are were not on the agenda?
There are none.
Okay, well, we're only about 10 minutes over, so well, thanks everyone for their all their informative input, and we'll see you in a month, November 13th. Stay safe.
Bye.
Meeting's adjourned, I guess.